She stepped into the small office, her worn-out shoes squeaking on the polished floor. Her hands shook as she smoothed her gray skirt, trying to look calm even though her stomach twisted with nerves. On her finger, the old silver ring glinted faintly under the fluorescent lights, a simple band with a tiny rose carved into it, the one her mom had given her years ago. It was her lucky charm today, or so she hoped. At 62, she needed this job more than ever. The bills were stacking up, and the widow's pension barely covered the heat. She took a deep breath, pushed her shoulders back, and sat down across from the boss. He was an older man, maybe late 60s, with deep lines etched into his face and a no-nonsense look in his eyes. His desk was cluttered with papers, a half-empty coffee mug teetering on the edge. He barely glanced at her resume, muttering something about her bookkeeping experience, when his gaze flicked to her hands. Then he stopped. His eyes locked on the ring. For a split second, she thought he'd just noticed a smudge or a scratch. But then his face changed, pale as a ghost, mouth dropping open. "Where did you get that?" he whispered, his voice so low she almost didn't hear it. She blinked, caught off guard. "This? It was my mom's," she said, twisting the ring nervously. "She gave it to me before she passed." His hands gripped the desk, knuckles white, and before she could say another word, he lurched to his feet. The coffee mug toppled, brown liquid spilling across his papers, but he didn't care. He stumbled backward, knocking into a filing cabinet, his eyes still glued to the ring like it was a bomb about to go off. I need a minute," he stammered, and then he was gone, bolting through a door behind his desk, leaving her sitting there, stunned. The room went quiet except for the drip-drip of coffee hitting the floor. Her heart pounded in her chest. What just happened? She looked down at the ring, its familiar weight suddenly strange on her finger. It was old, sure, but it wasn't fancy, just a plain silver band her mom had worn every day. Why would it scare him like that? She thought about chasing after him, demanding answers, but her legs felt heavy, glued to the chair. Maybe he'd had a heart attack or something. Or maybe he knew something she didn't. Minutes ticked by, and he didn't come back. She sat there, alone, the air thick with questions. Her mind raced. What if this wasn't about the job at all? What if that ring, her mom's quiet little treasure, held a secret she'd never guessed? She'd worn it for luck, but now it felt like a key to something bigger, something wild and hidden. And that man, the boss, he'd seen it and run. Whatever he was hiding, she had to know. If she walked away now, she'd spend the rest of her life wondering what she'd missed. This wasn't just an interview anymore. This was the start of something she couldn't turn back from. She sat there in the empty office, the silence pressing down on her like a heavy blanket. The coffee still dripped onto the floor, making a little puddle that spread under the desk. Her hands rested in her lap, and she stared at the ring, twisting it around her finger. It wasn't much to look at, just a scratched-up silver band with that tiny rose etched into it, but it was all she had left of her mom. She'd worn it today because she needed something familiar, something to steady her nerves. At 62, walking into a job interview felt like climbing a mountain. She'd spent months out of work, watching the savings dwindle, the fridge get emptier. This bookkeeping gig was her last shot at keeping the lights on. She glanced at the door the boss had disappeared through. What was his deal? 1 minute he'd been gruff, flipping through her resume like it bored him, and the next he'd turned white as a sheet and bolted. All because of the ring. She replayed his words in her head, "Where did you get that?" And the way his voice shook, like he'd seen a ghost. It didn't make sense. She'd lived a quiet life, nothing dramatic. Born in a small Midwest town, raised by a mom who worked too hard and a dad who died too young. After her mom passed, she'd married, had kids, lost her husband to a heart attack 5 years back. Just regular struggles, the kind most folks understood. So why did this ring, this little piece of her past, make him lose it? She stood up, her knees creaking, and paced the small office. The walls were bare except for a faded certificate and a photo of a fishing boat. The boss's chair was pushed back, papers scattered from his sudden exit. She thought about leaving, grabbing her purse and walking out, but something held her there. Curiosity, maybe, or desperation. She needed the job, sure, but now she needed answers too. That look on his face wasn't just surprise. It was fear, raw and real. And it was tied to her mom's ring. Her mind drifted back to her mom. She'd been a tough woman, raising her alone after her dad's accident at the factory. They'd never had much, rented houses, second-hand clothes, but her mom always wore that ring. It's special, she'd say, smiling faintly, but she never explained why. When she got sick, cancer eating her up fast, she pressed it into her daughter's hand. Keep it close, she'd whispered, her voice weak. That was 20 years ago. Since then, it had been a comfort, a quiet link to a woman who'd given her everything. But now, sitting in this strange office, she wondered if it carried more than memories. The clock on the wall ticked past 10 minutes. He still wasn't back. She sat down again, her fingers brushing the ring. Maybe it was valuable, some antique he recognized? No, it didn't look expensive. Maybe it was a coincidence, some ring that looked like one he knew. But deep down, she didn't buy that. The way he'd stared, the way he'd run, it was personal. She thought about her mom's life before she was born. She'd rarely talked about it, just bits and pieces about growing up in that dusty town, working as a waitress, dreaming of something bigger. Could there be a story there, something buried that this boss knew about? Her purse sat on the floor, her coat draped over the chair. She could leave, forget this weird morning, and keep looking for work. But her gut told her to stay. She'd spent her life playing it safe, working hard, keeping her head down, surviving. Now, at 62, with gray hair and tired eyes, she felt a spark she hadn't felt in years. Adventure, maybe. Or just a need to know. She'd come here for a paycheck, but she might have stumbled into something else, a mystery, a piece of her past she didn't even know was missing. Finally, she heard footsteps. The door creaked open, and the boss stepped back in. His face was still pale, but he'd pulled himself together, shirt tucked, hands steady. He looked at her, then at the ring, and took a slow breath. Sorry about that, he said, his voice rough. Let's talk about the job. She nodded, but her heart raced. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't over. That ring had opened a door, and she was about to walk through it. The boss stood in the back room, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He leaned against the wall, the cold plaster grounding him as his mind spun out of control. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the top drawer of an old metal desk, shoving aside pens and crumpled receipts until he found it, a small, faded photo tucked inside an envelope. He pulled it out, his fingers clumsy, and stared at the face he hadn't seen in 40 years. A young woman smiled back at him, her hair dark and wild, her eyes bright with hope. On her left hand, clear as day, was the ring, the same silver band with the tiny rose he'd just seen in his office. His stomach twisted, a sick feeling rising up his throat. He sank into a chair, the photo shaking in his grip. That ring wasn't just jewelry. It was a promise, one he'd made and broken decades ago. He'd been 25 then, full of big dreams and bigger mistakes. She'd been his fiancée, the love of his life, a girl from a small Midwest town who believed in him when no one else did. They'd planned a future, marriage, a house, kids, but he'd gotten scared. The night before their wedding, he'd packed a bag, left a note, and ran. No goodbye, no explanation, just a coward's exit. He'd built a new life after that, a business, a family, but the guilt never left. And that ring? He'd given it to her, engraved it himself with a rose because she loved flowers. It was supposed to be forever. Now it was here, on the finger of a gray-haired woman looking for a job. How? His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe she'd bought it at a pawn shop, or found it somewhere. But the way she'd said my mom stuck with him, heavy and sharp. He tried to remember, had his fiancée ever reached out after he left? He'd changed his name, moved across the country, made sure no one could find him. He'd heard she'd died years later, but he never checked, never wanted to know. What if she'd had a kid? His kid? The thought hit him like a punch, stealing his breath. He rubbed his face, the lines on his skin feeling deeper than ever. At 68, he'd seen plenty, ups and downs, losses and wins, but nothing like this. He'd built this little accounting firm from scratch, kept it running through recessions and sleepless nights. It was his safe place, his control. And now this woman, this stranger, had walked in and shaken it all loose. He looked at the photo again, her smile cutting into him. If that ring was hers, if this woman was tied to her, then his past wasn't buried like he'd thought. It was sitting in his office, waiting for him. He stood, shoving the photo back in the drawer. He couldn't hide forever, not from this. He had to know who she was, where that ring came from. But how? He couldn't just ask, "Hey, am I your dad?" That sounded crazy, even to him. He'd start small, feel her out, see what she knew. Maybe it was nothing, just a weird twist of fate. Or maybe it was everything he'd run from, crashing back into his life when he least expected it. He straightened his shirt, took a deep breath, and walked back to the office. She was still there, sitting with her purse in her lap, looking confused but patient. He cleared his throat, trying to sound normal. "Sorry about that," he said, sitting down. "Had to check something." "Let's talk about the job." She nodded, her eyes flicking to his face, then back to her hands. He noticed the ring again, glinting faintly, and forced himself to look away. "So, where'd you say you're from?" he asked, keeping his tone light. "A little town in the Midwest," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Born and raised there." "My mom too." His heart thudded. He knew that town, same place he'd met his fiancée all those years ago. "What was your mom like?" he pressed, leaning forward a little. She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Quiet. Hardworking. She passed when I was younger, but she was my rock." He nodded, his mind racing. "And the ring," he added, almost too quick. "She always wore it," she said, touching it. "Said it was special." He swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Looks like it is." He didn't say more, just offered her the job, bookkeeping, part-time, start tomorrow. She agreed, relieved, and left. He watched her go, the ring flashing as she waved goodbye. Tomorrow, he'd dig deeper. Whatever this was, he couldn't let it go. She walked out of the office, the weight of the morning settling on her shoulders like a damp coat. The air outside was crisp, a late March breeze tugging at her scarf as she made her way to the bus stop. Her purse bumped against her hip, and she kept her hand over the ring, rubbing it absent-mindedly. She'd gotten the job, part-time. Bookkeeping, decent pay, enough to keep the heat on and maybe fix the leaky sink. That should have been a relief, but her mind wouldn't settle. The boss's reaction gnawed at her, replaying in her head, his pale face, the way he'd bolted, those shaky words about the ring. Something wasn't right. She climbed onto the bus, found a seat near the back, and stared out the window as the town rolled by. Small brick buildings, a diner with a flickering sign, people shuffling through their day, it all looked normal, but she felt off, like she'd stepped into someone else's story. She'd lived here for years, ever since she and her husband moved after the kids grew up. It was a quiet place, good for a widow who didn't ask much from life. But now, at 62, with her knees aching and her savings thin, that quiet life was cracking open. The ring felt warm against her skin, heavier than usual, like it was trying to tell her something. The boss had come back calmer, sure, but his question stuck with her. Where was she from? What was her mom like? Why'd he care? She'd answered honest enough, born in that little Midwest town, raised by a mom who worked herself to the bone. He'd nodded, offered the job quick, almost too quick, and sent her on her way. "We'll talk more tomorrow," he'd said, his voice rough but steady. "Talk about what? The job, or something else?" She leaned her head against the glass, the rumble of the bus soothing her nerves. Maybe she was overthinking it. Maybe he'd just had a bad morning. But deep down, she didn't believe that. When she got home, the house was cold and still. She flicked on the kitchen light, set her purse on the counter, and filled the kettle. Tea would help, something to steady her hands. As the water boiled, she sat at the table, staring at the ring. It was scratched and dull, but that tiny rose still stood out, delicate and clear. Her mom had loved it, wore it through every shift at the diner, every late night sewing patches on her clothes. "Keep it close," she'd said, her voice frail near the end. She'd never said why, and back then, it didn't matter. It was just a ring, a piece of her mom to hold on to. Now, though, it felt like a puzzle piece she didn't know how to place. The kettle whistled, snapping her out of it. She poured the tea, the steam curling up, and took a slow sip. Her eyes drifted to a box in the corner, old stuff from her mom she'd never sorted through. Letters, photos, little keepsakes she'd packed away after the funeral. She hadn't touched it in years, couldn't face the ache of digging through the past. But tonight, with the boss's strange behavior buzzing in her head, she felt a pull. Maybe there was something in there, some clue about the ring. She set the mug down, her hand steady now, and pulled the box over. It was dusty, the cardboard soft with age. She lifted the lid, and the smell hit her, old paper, faint lavender. Her mom's scent. Inside were faded pictures, a few birthday cards, a scarf with frayed edges. She sifted through, gentle, until she found a small stack of letters tied with string. Her mom's handwriting curved across the envelopes, addressed to no one, just dates, like a diary she never sent. She untied them, her fingers careful, and opened the first one. "He left today," it started, the ink smudged. "Said he loved me, then packed his bag and ran. I'll never understand." Her breath caught. She'd never heard this story. Her mom had always said her dad died in an accident before she was born, a quiet man who worked at the factory. But this letter, dated a year before her birth, painted a different picture. She read on, piecing it together, a man who promised the world, then broke her mom's heart and disappeared. No name, just he. And at the bottom, a line that stopped her cold: "He gave me the ring, said it was forever. Guess forever's shorter than I thought." She sat back, the letter trembling in her hands. The ring on her finger matched the words, silver, rose, a promise. Could the boss be him? The man who'd run? Her heart raced, a mix of anger and hope churning inside. Tomorrow, she'd see him again. Tomorrow, she'd start asking questions. She barely slept that night, the letter's words tumbling through her mind like leaves in a storm. She lay in bed, the quilt pulled tight around her, staring at the ceiling as the clock ticked past midnight. He gave me the ring, said it was forever. Her mom's handwriting looped in her head, sharp and real, pulling up questions she'd never thought to ask. All these years, she'd believed her dad was a factory worker, gone too soon in an accident. That's what her mom had told her, quiet and firm, no room for doubt. But now, at 62, with that old silver ring glinting on her finger, she wondered if her whole life had been built on a lie. Morning came slow, gray light creeping through the curtains. She got up, her bones stiff, and made coffee instead of tea, something stronger for the day ahead. The letter sat on the kitchen table, folded but heavy, like it carried her mom's voice across the years. She read it again, sipping the bitter brew, her eyes lingering on every word. He left today. Packed his bag and ran. No name, no details, just pain scratched onto paper. She thought about the boss, his pale face, the way he'd stared at the ring like it burned him. Could he be the man who'd walked out? The one who'd left her mom alone, pregnant, with nothing but a promise and a piece of silver? She dressed slow, picking her best blouse, the blue one with the tiny buttons. The job started today, and she'd go. She needed the money, but it wasn't just about bookkeeping anymore. She slipped the ring on, feeling its weight, and grabbed her purse. The bus ride felt longer than yesterday, every stop dragging as her mind churned. She pictured the boss, his deep-lined face, his rough voice. He'd asked about her mom, her town, like he was fishing for something. And that photo he'd hidden away, she hadn't seen it, but she'd caught the quick move when he came back, shoving something in his pocket. What was he hiding? The office was quiet when she arrived, the air thick with the smell of paper and coffee. He was already there, hunched over his desk, scribbling numbers. He looked up as she walked in, his eyes flicking to her hand, then away fast. "Morning," he said, gruff but polite. "Desk's over there. Start with the invoices." She nodded, settling in, but her heart thumped loud in her chest. The day passed slow, filing papers, adding totals, the hum of a printer in the corner. He kept his distance, barking orders now and then, but she felt him watching her, stealing glances when he thought she wouldn't notice. Late afternoon, when the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the floor, he called her over. "Need you to check something," he said, pointing to a ledger. She stood beside him, close enough to smell his aftershave, Old Spice, sharp and familiar. He handed her a pencil, his fingers brushing hers, and she saw it again, that flinch, that quick look at the ring. She couldn't take it anymore. Her hands shook, but her voice came out steady. "Why'd you run yesterday?" she asked, locking eyes with him. "When you saw this ring?" He froze, the pencil dropping to the desk with a soft clatter. For a moment, he didn't speak, just stared at her, his face tight. Then he sighed, long and heavy, and leaned back in his chair. "Sit down," he said, pointing to the seat across from him. She did, her pulse racing. He rubbed his hands together, slow, like he was buying time. "That ring," he started, his voice low, "I've seen it before. A long time ago." He reached into his drawer, pulled out that same envelope she'd glimpsed yesterday, and slid a photo across the desk. She picked it up, her breath catching. A young woman smiled back, dark hair, bright eyes, the ring clear on her finger. It was her mom, no doubt about it, maybe 20 years old, alive and happy. "Who is this to you?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked away, his jaw tight. "She was my fiancé," he said, barely above a whisper. "We were supposed to get married. I left her, ran like a fool. Didn't know she was pregnant." The words hit her like a wave, crashing over everything she thought she knew. She stared at him, then at the photo, her mom's face blurring through sudden tears. "Pregnant?" she echoed, her throat tight. "You mean, me?" He nodded, slow, his eyes wet now too. "I think so. I didn't know, swear it. Found out she'd died years later, but no one said anything about a kid." She clutched the photo, anger and shock twisting inside her. This man, her boss, this stranger, could be her father. The ring tied them together, a thread across decades, and now it was unraveling everything. She sat there, the photo trembling in her hands, her mom's young face staring up at her through the faded ink. The office felt smaller now, the air thick and heavy, like it was pressing her down into the chair. Her eyes flicked to the boss, no, the man who might be her father, his head bowed, his hands clasped tight on the desk. The words he'd said hung between them, "I didn't know she was pregnant." Her chest tightened, a mix of anger and hurt bubbling up so fast she could barely breathe. All her life, she'd carried a story, her dad dead, her mom alone, a simple tragedy. Now this man was rewriting it, tearing it apart with a confession 60 years too late. She set the photo down, slow, her fingers lingering on the edges. "You left her," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the silence. "You gave her that ring, promised her something, and then you just ran?" He flinched, like she'd slapped him, but he didn't look away this time. "I was young," he said, his voice rough and low. "Stupid. Scared. I thought I wasn't ready, thought I'd ruin her life if I stayed. So I left. Wrote a note, packed a bag, and got out." He rubbed his face, the lines deeper now, etched with regret. "I didn't know about you. If I had." "If you had, what?" she snapped, leaning forward. "You'd have come back? Fixed it? You left her pregnant, alone, in a town where everyone talked. She worked double shifts, sewed clothes at night, all to keep me fed. And you were where? Building this? She waved a hand at the office, the papers, the life he'd made without them. Her eyes stung, tears hot and fast, but she didn't wipe them away. She wanted him to see. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. I moved west, he said, quiet. Changed my name. Started over. Met a woman, had a son, lost him to a car wreck 10 years back. Built this place to keep busy, to forget. But I never forgot her. Every day, I wondered what I'd thrown away. He pointed at the photo, his hand shaking. That ring, I made it for her. Engraved the rose myself. When I saw it on you yesterday, it was like she walked in here. Like the past came back to hit me square in the face. She looked at the ring, its silver dull but warm against her skin. Her mom's treasure, her last gift. All those years, it had been a comfort, a piece of love she could touch. Now it was something else, a link to a man who'd broken her mom's heart and didn't even know she existed. She never told me, she said, softer now, the anger giving way to something heavier. Said my dad died before I was born. An accident. I believed her. Why'd she lie? He shook his head, helpless. Maybe she didn't want you hating me. Or looking for me. She was good like that, strong, better than I ever was. I don't know. I wish I did. He leaned back, his eyes wet, and for the first time, she saw him not as the gruff boss, but as an old man carrying a weight he couldn't put down. When you walked in with that ring, I panicked. Thought it was a coincidence, some trick. But then you said it was your mom's, and I started thinking, what if? What if, she echoed, bitter. She stood, pacing the small space, her shoes scuffing the floor. I've got a letter at home. Found it last night. She wrote it the day you left, said you broke her, promised forever then took off. I grew up thinking I had no dad, that it was just me and her. Now you're here, and I don't know what to do with that. She stopped, facing him, her hands clenched. Are you sure? Are you really him? He nodded, slow. Your mom's name, your town, the dates, it lines up. I don't need a test to know. But if you want one, I'll do it. I owe you that much. His voice cracked, and he looked down, ashamed. I owe you a lot more, but I can't fix the past. I'm sorry, for her, for you, for all of it. She didn't answer, just stood there, the ring heavy on her finger. Part of her wanted to scream, to walk out and never come back. Part of her wanted to sit down, ask more, hear his side. She thought of her mom, alone, raising her, keeping this secret to her grave. What would she want now? The clock ticked, loud in the quiet, and finally, she spoke. I need time, she said, grabbing her purse. I'll be back tomorrow. We're not done. He nodded, silent, as she walked out, the truth still raw between them. She stepped out into the evening air, the cold biting at her cheeks as the door clicked shut behind her. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the pavement, and she pulled her coat tighter, her breath fogging in the chill. Her mind was a mess, a tangle of anger, sadness, and something she couldn't name, hope, maybe, or just exhaustion. She walked slow to the bus stop, the ring a steady weight on her finger, her mom's voice echoing in her head. Keep it close. All these years, it had been a lifeline to a woman she'd lost. Now it was a bridge to a man she'd never known, a father who'd left before she took her first breath. The bus ride home was quiet, the hum of the engine drowning out the chatter in her skull. She leaned against the window, watching the town slip by, lights blurring into streaks. She'd told him she'd be back tomorrow, but what then? Could she work for him, sit across from him every day, knowing what he'd done? Her mom had raised her alone, worked her hands raw, and died too young, all while he built a life somewhere else. Yet there he was, old and broken, spilling apologies like they could patch up 60 years of hurt. She didn't know if she wanted to forgive him or forget him. When she got home, the house felt emptier than ever. She kicked off her shoes, dropped her purse, and went straight for the box of her mom's things. The letter from last night sat on top, but she dug deeper, pulling out photos, a locket, a faded recipe card. She spread them across the table, piecing together a life she thought she'd understood. There was her mom, young and smiling, in a diner uniform, maybe where she'd met him. Another of her pregnant, hand on her belly, no ring yet. She must have gotten it later, after he left, a promise turned into a keepsake. She traced the rose on her own finger, tears welling up. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered to the empty room. Days turned into weeks, and she kept going to work. The job was simple, numbers, files, coffee runs, but the air between her and the boss was thick with unspoken words. He didn't push, just watched her with quiet eyes, giving her space. She watched him too, how he moved slower than he let on, how his hands shook when he poured his coffee. He was old, like her, worn down by time. One morning, he brought in a thermos and 2 mugs. "Made extra," he said, sliding one to her. They sat, sipping in silence, the first crack in the wall between them. Bit by bit, they talked. Not big stuff, not yet, just small things. He told her about fishing trips he used to take, how he'd built the business from nothing. She told him about her kids, grown and gone, and her husband's laugh that she still missed. The ring stayed on her finger, a silent thread tying their stories together. One afternoon, he pulled out the photo again. "She loved daisies," he said, pointing to her mom's smile. "Used to pick 'em by the road." She nodded, remembering bouquets on the kitchen table. "She kept that," she said, soft. "Even after you." Months passed, and the anger faded, not gone, just quieter. She started staying late, not for work, but to listen. He told her about the night he left, panic, a packed bag, a note he regretted the second he wrote. She told him about her mom's last days, weak but stubborn, whispering about the ring. They cried sometimes, together, over coffee or old photos. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, but it was something. A start. She saw her mom in him, his eyes, his quiet way, and it hurt less each time. One evening, as spring turned the air warm, he handed her a small box. Inside was a silver chain, simple and sturdy. "For the ring," he said. "If you want." She took it, threading the band onto it, and hung it around her neck. It rested near her heart, close like her mom wanted. "Thanks," she said, meeting his eyes. He nodded, a faint smile breaking through. They weren't fixed, not whole, but they were family, messy, late, and real. Looking back, she realized life doesn't tie up neat. At 62, she'd found a father she never knew she had, not in a fairy tale ending, but in hard talks and slow steps. The ring had brought them here, a piece of her mom that refused to let go. And the lesson? Hold on to what matters, love, family, truth, even when it's late, even when it hurts. Because sometimes, the things we lose find their way back, and that's worth everything.